your host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with the ongoing war on the edge of Europe. Armenia and Azerbaijan are accusing each other of attacking large cities in violation of a new ceasefire. The fighting erupted just hours after Russia brokered a deal. The OSCE Minsk group co-chair nations, France, Russia, and the United States, are expected to hold negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh region again on Monday in Moscow. The leaders have condemned the escalation of violence and urged both sides to observe the ceasefire. Renewed clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan erupted on September 27th, with intense battles raging in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. The area has experienced numerous skirmishes over the past 2 decades. Azerbaijan and Armenia have imposed the martial law and launched mobilization efforts. Both parties to the conflict have reported casualties, among them civilians. On the conflict, we have in Tbilisi, George Mishedlevich, who is an associate professor at the European University. In Moscow, we are joined by Dmitry Barbish, a political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. In Beijing, Zhou Rong, senior analyst from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to correct the pronunciation, first of all, of our first guest. I hope I could pronounce your family name right. First time talking to you, though. Mishedlishvili. Mr. Mishedlishvili, what a pleasure to have you on the program. Help us to understand the latest assessment of the situation. The ceasefire obviously did not work.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. As far as the situation is concerned, the stakes seem to be too high, particularly for Azerbaijan and for Armenia as well. So that's why, unfortunately, ceasefire do not hold. Civilians continue to be killed in very large quantities. This current flare-up, it's already a full-fledged war. It's no longer a flare-up on the conflagration that was occurring for 4 years ago for 4 days, or even in early July for a few days. So now the casualties, the fatalities count is in the hundreds. Well, it seems to be the positions are very entrenched. Even if you see the social media and the pronouncements of the officials, of the officers in Armenia, Azerbaijan, the language is so inflammatory. The attitude towards the other party is so dehumanizing. It's so, well, like almost like a racist and like inconceivable and unacceptable that one can understand that the hatred of the communities, the hatred of this even nations, like with very few exceptions, is so intense that well, now one can say in retrospect that the ceasefire was almost doomed, but it seems like it almost was. That's very unfortunate, and looks like there should be the outcome that would be, I would say, sellable to the population.
Okay.
Again, this like war rhetoric in Azerbaijan was so intense that now maybe kind of even this regaining some ground, regaining few regions might not be enough for the population. All the more since the bombing of Ganja, kind of the second largest city, as the other casualties, they increase the kind of this degree, the boiling point. And
let's also have the other two panelists to talk a little bit on their opinions, sir. If I could share a fair share of time to the other two. Mr. Barbish, you are joining us in Moscow. Russia has been a party that has been trying to bring both sides together. Of course, historically speaking, the conflict is very complicated. So, help us to understand what's the result between Russia and Turkish foreign ministers.
Well, I mean, we don't know all the details of the talks and in general of connections between Russia and Turkey. But of course, Turkey, I think, made a mistake when it 100% put itself on the side of Azerbaijan, when unfortunately this violence flared up again after 26 years of relative peace in that region. Let me remind you that the war actually started back in the times of the Soviet Union in 1988, when Nagorno-Karabakh, which is officially an Azerbaijani region, but which had and has an Armenian population, basically asked to be joined with Armenia. That was still in the framework of the Soviet Union. That was not done, of course, but unfortunately Armenia and Azerbaijan became enemies. And in 1994, the war ended basically with the victory of Armenia. Not only was the so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Republic not recognized by anyone, not only was it pronounced and kept, but also Armenians control 7 districts of Azerbaijani territory next to Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians say that this is security zone necessary for the protection of Nagorno-Karabakh. So in this situation, I think the country that would be most impartial will be the winner, because in this situation, if you show any sympathy towards one of the sides, you cannot be a peacemaker. You cannot broker a deal between these two really hostile parties, as our previous speaker rightly noted.
Well,
so
Mr. Barbish,
Russia, unlike Turkey, did not take any sides in this conflict.
Many believe, Mr. Barbish, that Russia is pretty much on the side of Armenia. At least that's the commonly believed concept. What do you make of that, if you're talking about impartial?
Well, if you look at the statements from the Russian government and you find me a single sentence that would say that Russia is somehow criticizing only Azerbaijan, that Russia is somehow on the side of Armenia, I will give you $1,000. Well, the media is a different thing, because the Armenian community everywhere, including Russia, is much more influential than the Azerbaijani community, with the exception of Turkey, of course. And the Armenian community is very active in the media. We have very diversified media, so yes, Armenians and their allies are making their case. But Azerbaijanis are making their case in the Russian media too, but I think you shouldn't so much look at the media, look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its statements, look at the official position of Russia and its president. The official position is impartial indeed, and that's why Azerbaijanis agreed to have these talks in Moscow. They would probably prefer to have them in Istanbul or Ankara, but then Armenia would not accept.
Yeah.
So in this situation, Moscow was chosen simply because it seems to be the most impartial at the moment.
Mr. Zhou.
Yes.
You are talking from Beijing. Of course, China is not a party involved, but the reason we have also you in the panel is trying to have someone from outside the region and to look inside into the issue. As both of our panelists earlier explained, this is not a new one. It's not a new conflict. It's a conflict that has been there since the 1980s, and probably since the end of the First World War.
Yes.
It is already becoming very much a region of conflict and disputes. So, Mr. Zhou, what do you make of its re-eruption, shall we say, again, of this conflict? And do you think we have learned at all the lessons from the earliest rounds of conflict, which killed at least 30,000 people from both sides?
Yes, I think, as we all know, Nagorno-Karabakh is a conflicting area which have at least 4 times conflicts for the last 40 years. We all know that 3 important neighbors which can, to a certain degree, influence Azerbaijan and Armenia. We all know that Azerbaijan has a special relationship with Turkey, because most of Turkish people does not regard Azerbaijan language as a foreign language. They think they are relative languages. But for Armenia, up to now, Turkey has not established official diplomatic ties with that. Because Armenian people always remember the slaughter of 1915, so-called 1.50 million population, 1.5 million population were slaughtered by Turkey, by Ottoman Empire, but which Turkey did not acknowledge that. For Iran, Iran has a very special relationship with both countries. You know, 1/4 of the Iranian population are Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan people just believe in Shiite. And also for Armenia, Armenia also has a special relationship with Iran because Armenia need some energy supply from Iran. So people regard Armenia is a pro-Western country. I don't trust so. I think the militarily supported by Russia and energy, on the regard of energy supported by Iran. For such country, it cannot be very pro-Western country. Just like Georgia. Georgia is also regarded as a pro-Western country, but I don't think so. Outsiders may influence the situation, but currently, all of the outsiders wanted to have a continuous ceasefire, especially they think should be a permanent ceasefire, but I don't really believe so. I think ceasefire will be, thank you.
Misha Delishvili, I'm sure, sir, you've been listening to the other two guests. It's an interesting situation, as illustrated by Mr. Zhou, that all of those who are from outside try to put ceasefire to the conflict, and yet the two countries are not coming close to a ceasefire at all, given all the complicated history that all of you somewhat illustrated within a short period of time. So what's next? Did we learn anything, or can we learn anything from eventually a result from the last conflict?
Well, whether we learn or not, like the people outside these two countries, of course, it's the matter of the two nations and of the two leaderships, actually kind of like to reconcile and come to the agreement. International community and the neighbors could assist, they could engage. One can, of course, argue, and probably not without reason, that currently the engagement is insufficient. Very unfortunately, kind of the statements of France and United States were like largely anemic. Only Joe Biden, which is like so far actually, well, not the president at the moment, and like doesn't hold the official position, like made the statement which showed some understanding, well, vision of the situation of the ground. So these statements of other members of the Minsk group, which are officially mandated to find the reconciliation and to negotiate, to support negotiations, they seem to be very inactive, with the exception of Russia. So Russia took the leadership role again in this particular regard. So in my personal opinion, the lack of the Western engagement is very bad. The very fact that it is not in the United States is very much distracted with the election, with the actually kind of with the COVID, obviously kind of very serious and painful issues and fundamental issues, but and also this America First formula. So the United States has been largely disengaged from the South Caucasus, and for me personally, as a citizen of Georgia, this is a worrying development, and therefore they cannot provide sufficient incentives like to the countries like to reconcile and to create a region. So I would argue, well, and probably kind of the next speaker might disagree and like add something to this vision. So Russia, in my opinion, is not very much interested in having this region united, because that Karabakh conflict seems to be the biggest hurdle in turning the South Caucasus area into the fully fledged region. There are so many benefits from having this functioning region of the countries because of its potential, because of the geographic position, because of the resources, like mostly carbohydrate resources of the Caspian Sea, but also others, that, well, the fact that the international community is disengaged, of course, is like negative. More engagement is necessary, but again, there should be there should be the interest, there should be benefits. Unfortunately, today the West doesn't see benefits of being more engaged in this region.
Mr. Barbish, what about that question posed by the earlier speaker? Hypothetical questions, of course, but what do you make of his theories?
Well, first I would say that not all history of that region and not all history of relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis is all black. There was a long period, 70 years, when there were hundreds of thousands of Armenians living in the Azerbaijani capital, Baku, in the 20th century, and they had excellent relationship with the locals, and Baku was called the Paris of the Caspian because it had all communities in it, Russians, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Jews, and they all lived in peace, and that continued for many years. Even here in Moscow, Azerbaijanis and Armenians are friends. You know, they often do business together, especially the older generation. The younger generation has been subjected more to nationalist propaganda, both in Armenia and in Azerbaijan. But I noticed that a lot of young people do not believe this propaganda. They believe they become free of it when they leave the region. So it's a conflict, but it is mostly right now limited to the antagonism, I would say almost tribal antagonism, because Nagorno-Karabakh is basically economically not a very valuable region. There is no oil there, there is no gas. It's a mountainous, very beautiful, but economically absolutely useless area. On the role of the West, unfortunately, in the last, I would say, 30 years, the role of the West was mostly negative. I mean, look at Iraq, look at Libya, where civil war continued after the Western intervention. So Transcaucasus, I mean, people there are very well informed about the developments in other countries. So maybe the reason why this time they went to Russia is because they see the experience in Iraq. They see the experience in Libya and also in Syria. So, you know, right now I agree with our previous speaker. Mr. Trump is good for nothing. He cannot be a negotiator. But maybe it's not such a bad thing, because if Mr. Biden continues in the same vein as Obama and Hillary Clinton, who managed to antagonize even China, a very peaceful country that tried to stay neutral in all of these conflicts, maybe the West should first reform itself, come to terms with itself, and then it can be a peacemaker. Right now, I think the West is simply unable, unfit to be a peacemaker in other regions, including such a fragile region as Transcaucasus. I think the way forward is to appeal to the nice pages of history, and there were such nice pages in the history of Transcaucasus. Azerbaijan always belonged to Iran. It is a Turkic-speaking country, but it had never been a part of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire. So bad blood between Turkey and Armenia cannot be automatically attributed to Azerbaijan. And the previous speaker, the Chinese speaker, he rightly described the position of Iran. I think the position of Iran is important to take into account. It refutes the idea that this is a religious conflict, because Iran is also a Muslim country, just like Azerbaijan. But Iran is pretty impartial, almost on the side of Armenia. Why? Because Iran has a substantial Azerbaijani minority, and Iran is afraid of separatism. So Iran is more or less neutral in this situation.
Right. The situations are quite complicated, involving all parties, and everybody has their own concerns. We hope everybody could contribute to the solutions. Before we go, we only have 2 minutes left. Mr. Zhou, any input about the way forward?
Yes. I suppose right now all the outsiders right now support the ceasefire, even including Turkey. So I think the ceasefire may continue for some time. Hopefully, the peace may stay long.
I'm not sure the ceasefire could stay for a long time, because the ceasefire has already been broken so far. George, before we go, any quick thoughts?
Oh, well, it's really difficult to provide a quick thought, but, well, there are people in both countries, and again, the speaker from Russia mentioned Russia. Well, there is an example of very peaceful coexistence of Armenian and Azerbaijanis, like next door, well, just like a few hundred meters from where I live. Like in Georgia, in Tbilisi, there are significant communities. About 6% of the population of Georgia are ethnic Armenian, 6% ethnic Azerbaijani. They live very, even current conflict, even current very toxic and vitriolic conflict and like social media war hasn't affected them so far, which is a good sign that there is an example of the two communities cooperating like peacefully. Well, they should go back and see the chapters of their history when Armenians and Azerbaijanis, modern Azerbaijanis or Caucasian Muslims at the time, coexisted peacefully in Nagorno-Karabakh, in that area. So the experience is significant. So they should go back to that good roots of their coexistence.
We hope that will be the case, but things are obviously more complicated than our hope.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, George Mishedilishvili, Dmitry Barbish in Moscow earlier joining us, and Joe Rong in Beijing. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.